What do you do as a community building facilitator? How many CBW experiences does one need before entering a facilitator training? What are some of the misconceptions about community building facilitation? These are some of the questions we are going to talk about today with none other than the highly experienced and highly respected Eve Berry. Thank you, Eve, for being here today with us again.
Quite welcome. Good to be here.
Let's start, shall we?
Sure.
Okay, our first question. How does community building facilitation differ from group facilitation in other settings?
Well, group facilitation, in contrast to community building facilitation, is much more active and I would say task focused. It's really evident in group facilitation that the facilitator is guiding the process, posing questions for the group to discuss, maybe providing feedback about where the group is or where it's going. And it's very clear the facilitator is helping move the group through the process. So they're much more active. Facilitator in a group facilitation will be involved in actually creating the agenda or making a meeting design with very concrete objectives, usually to solve a problem or, let's say, create a product or a service or have a brainstorming session, resolve an issue, maybe build a plan of some kind in a group setting. Facilitator might also even do some visible recording on flip charts to capture the proceedings of the group. So the facilitator's pretty visible and active. In community building facilitation, there are usually two facilitators, sometimes three, but usually two, who after the initial workshop setup and reviewing guidelines and setting the whole thing up are really pretty invisible. They're there and they're present, but they're not really very visibly active, which really allows the group to learn by its own experience how to facilitate themselves, how to move through the stages of the group process into emptiness and into a sense of community. So facilitators in the community building process are more in the background. In this form of facilitation, the facilitators are doing much less verbal interaction. Although community building facilitators are still fully present to what's going on in the group as a group facilitator would be, observing, sensing everything going on. So those are some of the differences.
All right. In the community building process, as you mentioned, there are typically two co-facilitators. Why are facilitators needed for the process?
Well, hey, 4 eyes and 4 ears are better than 2, especially if the group is large. We've done circles with 50, 60 people, and which people are usually astounded by. How can this group be so big sitting in a circle and still do this? But it's actually, the bigger the group, the better in many ways. So I kind of think of it like a pilot and a co-pilot in a big airplane. So you would not have just one pilot fly a big jumbo jet with all those passengers alone. So I think it's part of keeping the group safe, is having two facilitators. So why are they needed for the process? Well, facilitators, by being empty themselves, because when we facilitate, we're not full of ideas, we're not full of suggestions, we're not full of advice, we're not full of how to direct the group. We, in advance of that, empty all that stuff, let go of all that, wipe it out if we can, to the best of our human abilities. And so by being empty, and we also build community with each other in advance. That's a really important part of it. I can't prove this, but I think by being empty themselves and being in community ourselves, it actually plants a seed of community in the group. Now, whether it sprouts or not is another story, but I think that's a part of it. I think another reason why there's two and why they're needed is that there may be things going on in the group that happen that really touch the facilitators emotionally. Maybe somebody's speaking about their experience, a story of some kind, and it brings up a memory, or it touches something in me that I hadn't thought about in a long time, and I kind of get preoccupied by it. So it's always better to have two people while I work to get myself back being present to the group, rather than processing whatever is going on in me. So it requires a certain amount of self-discipline to say, oh, this is really touching something in me. Well, let me just put it aside for the time being. Doesn't mean you don't deal with it, but in the role of facilitator, we try to bracket those things. So I think another reason that we have two people and why there need to be facilitators is that it doesn't always happen, but often in the group process, especially in the early stages, when the group is in what we call the chaos phase, and they're focused on, this isn't working, we're not getting anywhere, and there's a lot of voicing of displeasure about the process and how other people should do different things, or you shouldn't do this and you should do that. A lot of shoulds are going on, and people are experimenting with voicing that displeasure. One of the objects of displeasure can be the facilitators, and they may be attacked or challenged for not providing sufficient direction or leadership. And so just by having two people there makes a little bit stronger container or holder for the group, instead of just one single person. So there's just so much that the facilitators do that you can't even see, really on a spiritual level.
Right. What do you actually do as a community building facilitator then?
Yeah, just by watching it from the outside, it's pretty hard to see what's going on, right? I'd say the first task, and I mentioned this before, is to prepare for the event. It's not something you just walk in and just say, okay, here we are and let's do it. There's a strong prerequisite to build community with your co-facilitator in advance of the workshop. I think that can vary depending on the relationship between the facilitators. I've worked with people that I know very well and have known for years. So in many ways, we're already in relationship and know each other, have a sense of community, but I've also facilitated people that I've never worked with before. So that might take a little bit longer. So one task is to do that work in advance of the workshop. What does that really mean to build community? Well, what it really means is to get empty. So to with the person you're facilitating with, to really examine every nook and cranny of yourself to see what you need to let go of to be fully present in the workshop. And typically that can be often just expectations about, hey, I'm facilitating this workshop. I want it to go well. I really want the group to reach community. I want them to have a good experience. All those things that ordinarily we would say those are things that we have hopes for the event. Those actually are barriers, believe it or not. So it's very different an approach. So I have to discover those things. It might be my nervousness, my apprehension. It might be I've got something going on in my life that is preoccupying my attention, and I have to put it aside. So that work is so important in advance. Once we actually get into the room and are ready to start the workshop, there's some logistical things like setting the room up and posting the guidelines and setting up the circle and things like that. And then when the workshop actually starts, the facilitators have already decided in advance who's going to do what. And so there's introducing the purpose of the workshop, a bit about Foundation for Community Encouragement, if it's a workshop either hosted by FCE, or because we're using that model, we always introduce that. And it gives a sense of why we're doing the work. And then we explain the guidelines, go over the guidelines, explain the guidelines, usually tell a story, which is just really to get the ball rolling. And then call the group into silence, call the group out of silence, and the adventure begins. So that's at the beginning. So the beginning has the most, beginning has the absolute most verbal presentation by the facilitators. After that, not that much. But during the actual circle time, the facilitators are paying very careful and close attention to how the group is progressing. I think the most important thing is discerning the patterns that the group is playing out in the various stages. Paying attention to what happens in the group where the group seems to feel more connected or lean into each other, if you will. And then what are the things that seem to pull people apart and make people less connected? And we're making mental note of that, maybe some physical notes of that. This is a little hard to explain, but another thing that we do as facilitators is to connect with spirit. When we talk about the process, we talk about community as a gift of the spirit. The principle of being moved to speak. Well, where does that come from? Another realm. And so we always, when we train facilitators, we talk about, you're co-facilitating with spirit. So therefore you better connect with spirit. However one does that. On a pragmatic level, the facilitators monitor the time, call for breaks. The group can't just sit there for the whole day without a break. Usually it's mid-morning, mid-afternoon, and then a lunch break. And then, of course, we break at the evening, overnight. And then during the breaks, the facilitators go into what we always call a huddle to talk about what's going on in the group. So we're not available for the participants to chat with and socialize with during the breaks because we're off processing the group, seeing, just sharing what we both have seen, what were pivotal events, what moved the group, what got the group stuck, what the patterns are. And then very quickly, you don't have much time to discern, is there any kind of a process comment we want to make to the group for it to become more self-aware of its own process? So it's not pats on the head. It's not, hey, you're doing a great job. It's not that kind of thing. It's not encouraging people. It's not, it also doesn't single out like, oh, Tiv had a fantastic story. We wouldn't do anything like that. It's more at the macro level of, the group seems to be struggling a lot with using I statements because we've noticed a whole lot of people saying we're all this or we're all that, or making generalizations. So we might just point something out like that, but it's not necessary to make a process comment. So it's always the comments are sparse. It's not a 5-minute dissertation. It's a few comments. So less is always more. I guess the last thing I would say is that from time to time, if the group does not handle something going on in the group, if it doesn't confront it, if a participant doesn't address some issue that's happening in the group and it gets avoided, it might be needed for one of the facilitators to what we call intervene, make an intervention. So for example, let's say people are talking and sharing and there's no space in between, right? So you're talking and you stop and then somebody else jumps right in, then somebody else jumps right in. And what happens is people are getting overwhelmed by not being able to process all that's going on. So if people are so eager to jump in that there's no space. Typically somebody in the group will say, I'm still back here with Joan. And she spoke 3 people ago, and I'm still back with her story. So I can't even hear what anybody else has said. And usually the group does that. But if the group doesn't do it and it keeps happening, that would be an example of an intervention that a facilitator would make. So you always wait for the group to take care of it first. Then if they don't, it's important to do that. Or another example is we're trained that if the group stays in chaos, if it stays in pseudo community for a long time, and I don't know, half an hour, I don't know how long that is exactly, but that the facilitator should stimulate chaos. So say something that actually gets the group gets the group out of pseudo community. I'll tell you a quick story on that. I facilitated a workshop one time. It's a large group with a large Christian group, 50, 60 people in the room. We went, so I guess it was pseudo community, but the group, after we went into silence, 55 minutes later, nobody had spoken. So there was just this very awkward, long silence. People are writing in their journals, they're sleeping or praying, I'm not sure which. You know, it went on a long time. And so we were just, my co-facilitator and I, we just were looking at each other across the circle going, what do we do here? And so we called a break and said, well, no, neither one of us had ever experienced that. You know, maybe a short, like 5 minutes or 10 minutes of silence, but 55 minutes was really unprecedented. So we decided to go back, and so what we said to the group was, either this group has a very rich inner life, or you're a very resistant group, which right away stimulated chaos. So that was an example of an intervention designed to stimulate chaos. And then finally, in terms of what do you do in general as a facilitator, at the end of the first day, when we close out the day, the facilitators will remind the group to have people take care of themselves, to be gentle with themselves, because it's an incredibly intense experience. And also to remember their dreams, because it might be a group dream. And pretty much the same for the second day. If the group reaches a state of emptiness, and then out of which community flourishes, that's the point when the facilitators can stop being facilitators and in effect join the group as participants. It's fine. Other than that, also the facilitators would help move the group into the closure of the workshop, let's say the last hour or so, reminding the group that this group is going to die. This is the last time we're going to ever, this group will exist in this moment in time. So to have that closure. So that's pretty much, I mean, I guess there's a lot, but those are the things that a facilitator does.
Oh, thank you. I've been in community building workshops with 2 facilitators, and sometimes there are 3. Why is that?
I think the most plausible reason for that is that the third person is in training, that they're an intern. They're there with the other 2 facilitators learning about facilitation. They've never done it. Maybe they've been trained, gone through the training program, but they have not actually facilitated a workshop. I suppose there are some instances where you might have an extra large group. So you might have 3 facilitators. I know that Community Building in Britain, which is a group over there, often uses 3 facilitators. That's really not how we've done it in the US. It's usually done only if the person's an intern, and they may or may not say anything in the group at all. But they're part of the breaks, the huddle, the discussion. So they're in on what happens between facilitators.
All right.
So that's why you have 3. That's why there are 3 sometimes. I've even seen it with 4. I've done it with you know, I've had 4 people, which is quite unusual, but.
How are community building facilitators trained, and how many CBWs, community building workshop experiences, does one need before entering a facilitator training?
Well, it's changed. How people are trained has changed over the years. In the early days of the Foundation for Community Encouragement, Scott Peck and others associated with the foundation identified people to be potential facilitators. They invited them to workshops, and then from that there was a discernment process where they invited them back to be facilitators and go into training. So in the early days, that's how people were trained, and they would we would have two or three what were called facilitator roundtables every year, and Scotty would do those along with some of the staff, the senior staff, and train us in whatever. But we would build community, and then we would have some kind of a learning part of the roundtable. So that's how we did it for a very long time. But then there was also an elaborate discernment process where people were paired, more experienced people paired with, so a primary facilitator, secondary facilitator, senior, junior, if you will. And there were a lot of workshops in those days. There was a lot of opportunity to co-facilitate and learn and everything. And then they had enough facilitators, so they stopped doing that for a while. So they didn't train any more people. And then about sometime in the late 90s, early 2000, we made the decision to develop a community facilitation program. So to train people how to facilitate, because so many people were interested in it. So there was a group that developed a whole curriculum, and then we started doing that. And we're training, I don't know, a lot of people. We probably did it 2 or 3 times a year for a while. We'd have groups of 30, 40 people and go through a whole 5-day training. And then over the years, we increasingly shifted and restructured it to be more experiential, less didactic, more practice. And so that's really what we do now. Is we have a 5-day experiential program where we start with the basics, like how do you set the workshop up, how do you explain the guidelines, which sound easy. It sounds easy. Oh, you just read the guidelines. Well, not. Have you ever been in a workshop where all people did was read the guidelines and the group was clueless? So they do need. You need to explain and practice using examples that people understand. And so we go from the basics, which are those things, to introducing into the process things that typically happen in the workshop. And we do that with role playing. So, so people get the experience of what do you do when there's somebody in the group who insists on intellectualizing about everybody's comments, or analyzing everybody's comments, or giving advice, or preaching, or always having to be positive. And why are we focusing on the next? So we introduce the things that happen in workshops, and so the group gets to see how the group deals with those, what works, what doesn't work. So we then do a lot of work with that. We talk about the huddle, what goes on during the breaks, and then we move on to some of the more difficult and sensitive things that might happen in a group. May not happen very often. Somebody has a mental health crisis. What do you do? Violence breaks out. The things that how the group deals with an incredibly shocking revelation or confession that somebody shares that's hard for people to hear. So it progresses. So we, over the course of the time, we progress, and people are practicing community building facilitation the whole time as all these things are going on. And then we're, we have materials and all that. So, so that's how it's done now. We haven't done it in a while because of COVID, but I just had a conversation with Michael Schmidt a couple days ago, and we're planning on doing a facilitation training again. That will likely be a hybrid of some in-person things and then some ongoing online work with a cohort of people who want to go through anywhere from we haven't quite decided, but it could be over maybe a 6-month to a year-long process. So we're about to do that again. People seem quite interested in it, and I've also been. I'm in an ongoing group, and I'm one of the facilitators. And what we're doing is people who are in the group that want to learn facilitation co-facilitate with me, and then they rotate in. They rotate out after about 4 weeks. So it's not the same as facilitating a whole community building 2-day experience, but people are learning a lot about facilitation just by those little internship periods. And then we do all the same things, it's just abbreviated. So that's how people are trained. There's also, in that is always a discernment process, whether the person's ready to be a facilitator. And the primary thing that we look for in training facilitators and in saying, yep, you can be a facilitator is one thing, and that's capacity to be empty. If people can't be empty, it's hard to facilitate. So that's how we train people.
Okay. That was another question. How many community building workshop experiences does one need in your view or in your experience before entering a facilitator training?
Good question. When we first developed the training, there were so many people who wanted to be trained as facilitators, but they'd never gone to a workshop. So that was this is not something you can train people in if they haven't experienced. So we made a prerequisite that people had to have attended at least one workshop. And in my opinion, that's not enough. We did it, but I don't think it's sufficient, because in one workshop, you don't get enough exposure to what happens in the process to really have a clue about what it's about. So I'd say that if somebody had gone to 2 or maybe 3 workshops, that's probably sufficient. I would hope that, not that we can prescribe this, but that at least one of those workshops, the person had had a pretty profound sense of the group reaching a sense of community. Because groups let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, there's always some sense of community. Might be very subtle, but you know, if you've been to a workshop and they're all 2s or 3s, where community kind of came up and kissed us on the cheek, you know, that's not going to give you enough sense of what it really is. So I would hope that people had at least one experience where they go, oh, this is why we're doing this. So so I'd say 2 or 3 is probably enough. And
all right. Yeah, I think you have already touched on this, but let's see if there are anything more to it. What kind of advanced preparation is needed before facilitating a community building workshop?
Well, we talked about the building community with your co-facilitator. So I think I've already spoken to that. I think on a personal level, it's probably worth mentioning that I have to check my own emotional mental health before I facilitate. So this self-discernment about my own state of mind is really critical. So for example, there was a period when I did the advanced preparation. It's not exactly advanced preparation, but it's really deciding whether I should be facilitating or not. When my father was dying from cancer, and then for a while after his death, I was just too full of sorrow, and I had a lot of grieving to go through, and it was pretty clear to me that I wasn't in a frame of mind to be able to facilitate. So I think that's some advanced preparation, is knowing where you are in your own life. And we know that goes up and down. So I guess the other, this might sound a little odd, but I think advanced preparation for facilitation is to keep doing community building as a participant. So I know people who, once they became facilitators, never participated. And that doesn't make any sense to me. To only be a facilitator, I think could actually be a little dangerous. And so I know I continue to not just be in the facilitator role, but attend workshops, be a participant, go through the process, struggle again. It keeps me cognizant of what people in the group really are going through. So that's another thing to mention.
All right. What are the most challenging aspects of doing community building facilitation?
I think the hardest thing for people, not just as in facilitation, but in the workshop itself, is to let go of the need to control what's going on in the group. So that's a challenging thing, is, you know, I want it to go a certain way and it's not. That's control. May not look like control, may not be obvious, but wanting it to be a way that it is other than how it is control. And that's hard to let go of. So that generates frustration, and that's control. So control is really one of the primary things that I've had to unlearn, is the need to control, and the reality that I can't control what I can't control. And there's a whole lot I can't control. So I can't live in the delusion that I can control very much. So, so that's a challenging aspect. I'd say it's challenging to stay fully present for hours and hours and hours and hours, listening, not going away, not allowing myself to get distracted or bored or tune out. That's challenging. Now, the good side of that is that it's made me a marathon listener. So I can listen almost forever. I probably listen too much now. But I'd say being present for long periods, and it's emotionally very exhausting to do that. It gets easier, but most people have a very short attention span. So this really strengthens the attention muscles that we develop. I'd say another challenging thing is when I'm in the facilitator role, to discern when I move to speak. I'm in the facilitator role. It's really, especially if it's powerful, what to do. And I think, as I mentioned, I do my best to put it aside, to bracket it, to empty it silently on my own, realize that I've got to come back to it. But I've also had the experience, and I know others have too, that if I'm in the facilitator role and we're co-facilitating with spirit, and I'm moved to speak in an extremely powerful way, who am I to push that aside? Maybe it is meant for the group. And so discerning that is extremely difficult. And so I'd say that that's pretty challenging. But I have witnessed and been in the situation where I was moved to speak about something because the group needed to hear it, and it actually was pivotal in moving the group usually into emptiness. Sometimes the group doesn't know how to empty. What does it look like, you know? But once you listen to it, you experience it, and you feel it, oh, okay, I get it now. So that's hard. That's hard to discern. Another reason for 2 facilitators.
All right.
In case that happens.
What are some of the misconceptions about community building facilitation in your view?
Well, I've touched on this already. Misconceptions that the facilitators don't really do anything. What do? You know, come in, they read the guidelines and, you know, call silence and the breaks, and that's it. So I think that's a misconception that they're not doing anything. I think another misconception is that somehow this is group therapy, and that but it's therapeutic for sure, but it's not group therapy. So I think that comes up a lot in groups. Oh, you know, this is just like, you know, group therapy. I think there's another misconception that somehow it really is up to the facilitators to make things happen. Certainly they get criticized for not doing more to move the group along. But you could often feel in a group where there really is a misconception that the facilitators have more responsibility than anybody else for the group reaching community. And that's a misconception, because it's totally up to the group. And there's no guarantee. We say that up front. There's no guarantee that this group will reach community. No guarantee. So those are the biggest ones I can think of.
Thank you. What are some indispensable qualities, traits, or virtues for being a good facilitator?
Humility. Willingness to self-examine. I always have to look in the mirror. Patience. Really have to be patient. Capacity to be non-judgmental. Good communication skills. How do you articulate? How do you witness what's going on in the group? Communicate it in a neutral way that doesn't come across as criticism, but observation. That's hard. So it takes some learning to do that. And, I guess the last thing I'd say is a lot of self-discipline. So those are some. I'm sure there are more, but those are a few. So.
Okay, so probably the last question for today. Can you give any updates about the publishing of your book, Eve?
Well, it's getting close. This week I received the proofs from the publisher that I have to review and accept, and I should be getting the cover, all the cover design and all the stuff that goes actually on the cover of the book this week as well. And then it'll probably be out there by, I'm guessing, mid-May, early June, depending on, I think that's what the production schedule looks like at this point. So of 2022, this is 2022. So soon, hard to believe, but, and there's a whole section in the book on what we're covering here about the role of what is facilitation and many of the things we talked about and more.
So we don't have to wait much longer then.
No.
Okay, so these were some of the questions we could include today. There were some other ones that I think we have made a careful consideration. And thank you for listening to us today. Thank you, Eva, once again for taking the time.
Thank you, Tim.
And I wish to all our listeners all the best, and see you in another episode.